Good morning, everyone. Does anyone have any questions about the courseworks or anything before we start? By the way, I do get quite a lot of email. And if you send me an email saying, I have this question about this, usually my response will be, can you ask this question in class, after class, or in the Teams chat, the Research Methods Teams chat? I generally do not answer questions on a one-on-one email. And that's just for logistical purposes, right? I can't. If everybody sends me individual emails, I won't be able to keep up. So that's why we have the Teams chat. That's why we have this lecture, right? And we have the discussions after lecture. And that way I can manage the large numbers. No questions about courseworks? Coursework 2 is released, so to speak. So I finished the write-up of coursework 2, and you can see that on Moodle, and if you want to start having a look at that as well, you can start looking at that. Okay, if there are any questions, feel free to interrupt at any time, or if you have any comments or anything on your mind, feel free. So I don't know if anybody can remember, but we had a special slide at the beginning of the previous lectures that said, these are the different ways we can collect evidence and gather information to support our hypothesis or conclusion. And one of the categories was statistical methods, another category was visualization, and the third category here is qualitative methods, right? We talked about qualitative and quantitative methods. And so today we're continuing on that conversation, and we're going to talk about qualitative methods that allow you to gather evidence to support a hypothesis or answer a question. So we're going to talk about interviews and focus groups. So a very popular technique to gather information and evidence about any hypothesis or question is through interviews. And so we're just going to have a very brief introduction to interviews and focus groups, which is part 2 of the lecture. So interviews can be used to obtain factual information, opinions, examples, understanding how someone performs a particular task, or understand how they feel about a special situation or task. So usually interviews are recorded on either an audio device or a video and audio device. And then afterwards, there's usually a transcription of those interviews, or and then a subsequent analysis of the information. So when we use interviews, they usually have a special purpose, right? They want to gather some special information. Interviews very often occur after an experiment. So imagine you've set up an experiment and you want users to participate in the experiment. It's very common to have an interview after an experiment that asks the participants special questions about their experience. Like, how did you like using the software? Did you struggle with any of the features of the software or the features of this experiment? Were you able to accomplish the tasks that were given to you? or did you struggle with some of the tasks? So an interview has a specific purpose which would typically explain an interviewee in the beginning, right? For example, this is part of a series of interviews to understand how social media influences people's political activism and voting behavior. And then you would explain the structure of an interview to an interviewee. So I'll ask you a few questions over the next 20 minutes, and then I might ask you to tell me more about certain topics. So to go into more depth into certain topics. And then you clarify how the data will be used. The interview is to gather data, right? And then you clarify how is that data going to be used. I mean, usually it's anonymized, analyzed, and then compared to other interviewees' data somehow, right? That's the typical usage. And then you also want to think about how you will analyze the interview data before you perform all the interviews. Does anybody remember the advice from last week on this topic? That would be very difficult to remember that, I guess, to remember something from a week ago. Does anybody remember anything from yesterday? So the advice I gave a week ago was whenever you conduct any kind of experiment or study, you run a pilot test. That means you test it out first on a small number of people from start to finish, including the analysis, to find out if there are any bugs in your experimental setup. So that's something you want to do, right, before you conduct, say, 20 interviews. If you're going to conduct 20 interviews, you don't conduct 20 interviews right from the start. You conduct 2. And then see how they go, analyze the data on 2, go through the whole process, see if it's working. And then, right, it's like manufacturing something. You don't manufacture 1,000 cars on your first try. You manufacture 1 car and then see if it works. Then you manufacture 2, test it out a few times, and then the numbers get bigger. So types of interviews. Interviews can be structured and closed, so you have the exact same questions for each participant, and there's no deviation. Right? They can also be semi-structured, a sequence of core questions and topics, each of which opens up a discussion, and sometimes also some factual questions. So you can ask a question here, you might get an answer, and then you might follow up with a more deeper discussion of that topic. Right? That's the most common, probably, well, it's a very common interview category. And then you have unstructured or conversational interviews, where you don't really have a fixed set of questions, you just have a fixed set of discussion topics, and it can go in any direction, the discussion. There are different kinds of interview questions, like factual, right, yes or no, true, false. Narrative, so tell me about something you experienced, like did you struggle on performing any task in this experiment? Opinions, opinion questions, how does Moodle compare with other VLE systems that you've used in your prior studies? Or, in your opinion, what could we do to improve the research methods class, right? That's impossible. What could we do to improve the usability of this software, for example, would be a typical opinion question. Ideas, if you were to improve Moodle so that your studies were more effective, what would you change, right? Or if you're using this software to complete some tasks, what would you change? How could you make it faster, for example? And this is very important, follow-up questions. This is a highly, highly underrated category of questions. And it's really important, actually, the follow-up questions. You said that you'd like to see more video content. What sort of content would be useful in supporting your studies? So it happens a lot that you ask a question, you get an answer, but the answer is incomplete and you want to have more information about their answer, like why did you say that? Or why is that your opinion? Or how did you get to this state? Right? By the way, this is also true in real life. Like if you're just talking to a person and you're having a conversation, if you look carefully at like human-human interaction, there's a lot of trouble in this area. Like somebody will say something interesting, and there's no follow-up in the conversation. It's just cut off, done, and important information is left out. You see that in real life human conversation, human-to-human conversation. That's something I've noticed quite a lot, actually. So for interview, we have general guidelines on conducting good interviews, right? Consistency, for example, you always ask the same question and using the same words, right? Because changing the wording will change the answers, generally, the kind of answers you get. You can include open-ended questions, right? But don't expect closed factual questions to lead to open-based answers or opinion-based answers, right? You can reformulate questions that are closed, right? Have you ever used augmented reality systems as a closed yes or no question, right? That's a factual question. But you can open that question up by saying, tell me about your experience of using augmented reality systems. Right, you get a very different answer. And then the follow-up questions are how, what, perhaps why, and so on. Where, when, and with who. Right, those are all follow-up questions that you'd want to ask to get more clarification. Try to avoid questions that are too vague. For example, what do you think about that software? If you start out with a question that's very vague, that's certainly one that's going to require follow-up to get more concrete information out of them. So there it is again. Ask follow-up questions sometimes. Right? When somebody tells you something, they answer a question, it happens that it needs very often a follow-up question, right? How would you fill in the metaphor professors are like X? You wait for the answer and then you ask why, for example. That is really, really important. And I find this to be important in my everyday life, by the way, and in my professional life. And when I'm conducting interviews. So somebody will, like, especially with a software evaluation, when you conduct a software evaluation with somebody, people will say something like, oh, I really like that feature. And that's the end of the sentence, and they'll just stop. But that's nice to say, but the real question is, okay, why? You have to follow up with why. Why did you just say that you like this feature? That happens so often when you start getting into this business. And like, I have a little set of guidelines that I give to my PhD students when they're conducting interviews, because PhD students don't have this skill. Generally speaking, nobody has that skill, generally speaking, if you pay attention, of follow-up questions. Very few people have that skill. So when I'm supervising master's or PhD students, I have a little set of guidelines about how to ask questions, and it always says, pay close attention to any statements and always ask why when you get a closed statement. Because so much information gets closed off if you don't ask the follow-up questions. Give the interviewees time. Short periods of silence are fine. Right? Some people will talk until you interrupt them or go off on tangents. That's not too surprising. Ask neutral questions. For example, tell me what you've been good and what have been the good and bad points of online learning. Not, do you agree with the online learning has been a disaster for everyone involved, right? Similarly, make sure that you don't bias the direction of the answer. Why are you unhappy about something, right? I mean, that's a whole area of social science, right? How to bias your questions. Who here has taken statistics? I remember there were some people in here that took statistics. There were some people, I remember. Anyways, if you do take statistics, you'll know that statistics can be biased. Right? You can produce any statistic you want, depending on how you structure the words in your interviews. Right? You can get any answer you want, basically, any statistic you want. There it is again. Also ask why. Why can sometimes lead people to try to think of a cause and effect relationship that doesn't really exist, or provoke defensiveness. You mean, why did you? But it is read as, why on earth did you? Anyways, always ask this, well, maybe not always, but try to include follow-up questions in the form of why. Try to use neutral prompts and neutral language, right? For example, yes and go on. You can also echo back to people what they said, summarize what they said, echo it back to them. That's called mirroring, right? It's a good listening skill. And try to avoid saying that some answers are correct and some answers are incorrect. You want to keep it as neutral as possible. Ask for clarification. That's that follow-up again. If they say, we did this, ask who did it. If they say, it's difficult to, and then you ask why. That's the follow-up questions again. Right? That's so common. So common. Now in your day-to-day interactions, you can start noticing this, by the way. So think about your interviewee. Will they understand the terminology you use? If you see that they don't understand the terminology, you can ask them if they understand the terminology or if they need some clarification. So if there's any special terminology, normally you would explain that special terminology before the interview. Normally that's what you would do. And you can include structural information in your interview. I noticed when I have interviews, I do a lot of interviews in different settings, professional settings, unprofessional settings. And I noticed that I often have structural information as part of the interview. Like I say, okay, I'm going to ask you a set of questions that are about logistics. Right, and then I'll ask the questions, and then I'll say, okay, the next set of questions is not about logistics, but it's really about your personality and your character, right? Starting with easy questions is very common. It's probably the most common thing, and then the questions might get more and more complicated as they go on. And ask one question at a time. And of course, the interviews have an end. This is also part of the structure. This is the structural information. At the end of an interview, there's always this question: do you have anything more to add or to say on any of the topics that we have discussed? Right? And then you tell the interviewee, are you clear with what happens to your information now? Right? And you can withdraw. You clarify again that the answers that they give are anonymized, the data analysis is anonymized, and so on. So their identity is never revealed. And then you make it clear that the interview is over. By the way, this is the last question of every job interview, by the way. So if you ever go to a job interview, that's the last question. Do you have any questions for us? That's always the last question at a job interview. So there's overlap with job interviews in this lecture, actually. So the interview data is analyzed. So you record the interview, and then those recordings are usually transcribed. It could be automatically, right? There's a lot of automatic transcription services. University of Nottingham actually provides, or used to provide, an automated transcription service. You can record a meeting in Teams and use the transcript download. And you normally remove a lot of the information from the transcripts, like the ers and ahs and ums, the stammering. Sometimes you include actions in the transcription, like the interviewee, stayed silent for 5 minutes before they answered the next question, for example, or they tried to punch me in the face during the interview, something like that, if there's some significant action. And then there's also software for organizing and coding interviews. So we mentioned this last week, this in vivo software. It's not the only software for encoding interviews. It just happens to be popular, and it's something I believe that the University of Nottingham has a license for. So typically the natural language text is read, and then it's categorized manually, right, by whoever's reading it. And you try to look for patterns and trends, reoccurring themes, right? Outliers, things that are only mentioned once by one person, some unusual content. And this is typically called a thematic analysis. You're looking for reoccurring themes and outlier themes. So you're looking for themes and concepts and statements related to your original hypothesis or your original topic. And then you try to build some structure to support theories about what people think, want, do, believe, or feel, and so on. There's a common technique called the grounded theory approach to analyze interview data or any natural language text data. Remember, we're getting into the realm of analyzing natural language texts as opposed to quantitative data. Grounded theory is not so easy to describe. It's tough to get to pin down a precise definition of grounded theory. But the idea is As researchers review in this case, the interview data collected, ideas or concepts become apparent to the researchers. These ideas and concepts are said to emerge from the data. The researchers tag those ideas and concepts with codes that succinctly summarize the ideas and concepts. As more data is collected and re-reviewed, codes can be grouped into higher level concepts and then into categories. These categories become the basis of a hypothesis or a new theory. That's the summary of grounded theory. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, right? Some of you are thinking, well, okay, I'm looking at an interview. I can go through and I can read the interview and I can start trying to find themes, right? And summarize those themes. But my choice of themes is going to be a little bit subjective, right? Like, I might choose the themes that I find most interesting, and I might use the words that I find most appropriate. But that's going to be a little bit subjective, right? It's gonna depend on me. So how is it possible to make the process more objective, so it doesn't depend on one singular person or one singular person's analysis? Any ideas? Did I put everybody to sleep? So if everybody's asleep, now it's time to wake up. Anybody want to take a stab at that question? How can we make this process a little bit less subjective in depending on one individual person or one individual person's background, experience, and opinions? Any ideas about that? Nobody's ever conducted interviews here. Has anybody ever conducted an interview? Okay, well, it's time to start conducting interviews then. Nobody has any idea about how to make this a little bit more objective? I think we're just going to sit here for a while. Google could have given you the answer by now. So the way you make it more objective is you have more than one person doing the coding. So you have an interview or a set of interviews. One person does the coding, gets a set of categories, and then another person does the same process, gets the same, and then you do a comparison. And if you want, you can add a third person. And then you find out, okay, where are the common themes amongst all three of the coders, right? Make it a little bit more objective. Okay, so that's all about interviews. Any questions about interviews? I'm surprised nobody here has ever conducted an interview before. I mean, it's pretty simple. So I encourage you to start conducting interviews. Right? Even you can do interviews even when they're not for business purposes, right? Just for fun. Nobody here has ever done an interview for a YouTube channel or something? Does anybody here have a YouTube channel that they maintain or anything like that? Wow. Wow. It's time to get this class to be a little bit more active, active in life. When I was a kid in school, we did interviews. We did interviews in my school starting at age 10. Nobody did interviews in school here? We would interview our own relatives. So if our own relatives went through some historic event, we would interview them. So for example, I would interview my grandparents about World War II or something like that. Or one of my relatives interviewed another relative about like the invasion of Vietnam, for example. Right, you guys never did any interviews in school where you actually like interview people that had special experiences? You did?
Yeah.
Okay, at least somebody. Now you can analyze the interview. Now you know how. You can code. If you have a transcription of it, you can code it and start analyzing it. Anyways, if you haven't interviewed people, then I highly encourage you to start doing so. It's a great way to learn new things, right? It's very common. Okay, so that's about interviews. Now we're going to talk about focus groups. Okay, that seems reasonable. Anybody here heard of focus groups before? Good. I can understand if you're unfamiliar with focus groups, right? That's understandable. Right? If you've never participated in a focus group or done anything in a focus group, I understand that. That's not something we typically do in schools. So focus groups are a kind of group discussion. So you can think of focus groups, instead of interviewing one person, you're interviewing a group. You can think of it like that. So instead of asking one person one question, you're asking 5 people one question, or 20 people one question, the same question. But it's not the same as a survey. So a survey is asking 20 people the same question, but it's still individual. It's still an individual, fundamentally an individual process. The focus groups is trying to get some agreement between the interviewees, right? The people participating. Right? So focus groups are a kind of group discussion. They share characteristics with interviews and some of the ideas, right, from interviews. And then we'll highlight the differences, what makes them different from one-on-one interviews and how to run them. So focus groups are a kind of interview or facilitated discussion. And you are, instead of an interviewer, you are a facilitator, asking questions and getting individual responses from a wide range of people. You target a specialized group of users to get a deeper, more effective understanding. So if you're writing software for a very special set of people, like maybe you're writing software only for people that work at a bank, right? Not the whole general population, but just for bank employees. Then you could have a focus group. You could conduct a focus group to try to extract information from the bank employees on how to improve the software, for example, right? So it's for a very targeted group of people, not the general public. Typically, the members of a focus group all have something in common, like a special skill. Could be a set of doctors. That's very common, by the way. Doctors or healthcare professionals, nurses, engineers. And then you try to organize the thoughts and the feedback during the focus group session. Focus groups have a specific purpose, just like interviews, right? Interviews have a purpose the same way that focus groups do. It could be a question. Usually the question is like, here's some software, how can we improve it? Or here's a process that you commonly perform, how can we make that process, how can we improve that process? Make that process easier, or make it faster, or make it somehow with less friction, remove some of the bugs from the process. How can we make getting a master's degree easier? For example. And then you solicit reflections, ideas, and thoughts on the matter, right? And then they typically have a focus in the sense that the group members share something in common, right? They're all a certain kind of user, generally speaking. They all use something in common, right? They work at the same employer, for example, or they have the same skill. Maybe it's like civil engineering, for example. It could also be that they have the same demographic characteristic, like it's all school children, for example, like you're targeting, their focus group happens to be children, right? These are some focus groups. These are like, a lot of focus groups are seniors, for example, retired people, or maybe people in wheelchairs, or so on. Those are just some examples of focus groups. And then you play the role of facilitator as opposed to interviewer. So this is more about like the logistics and how to structure a focus group. Has anybody participated in a focus group before? By the way, I have. This is not as common as interviews, focus groups. I think one of the reasons focus groups are not as important is because you need to figure out like a meeting time for a whole group of people, right? You need to meet in a special location at a special time, and you have to make that agreement between, say, 25 to 50 people, which is not as easy, right? So you welcome the participants and thank the participants for coming and explain the purpose of your focus group, what kind of information you're hoping to gather, right? And then this example is a group of students that are Moodle users, right? And the purpose of the focus group is to make suggestions on how to improve Moodle. So you explain why you've brought the focus group together and what you're hoping to get out of the focus group. By the way, this information is usually already in the invitation. So to form a focus group, you need to invite people, and that information is normally in the invitation. Like, we are assembling a focus group for the following purposes. Would you like to participate in this focus group? Right, so that's usually explained even before a person joins the group. So the focus groups have a structure, they have a set of questions, right? Could be 5 to 10 questions. If the group is too big, like in this class, right, we have the workshops on Fridays. We subdivide the class, right, into smaller groups of 4 to 6 people. That's very common in focus groups too. Focus groups are very often like 25 to 50 people. But rather than trying to have a discussion with all of them at the same time, they're subdivided into groups of, say, 5 to 10, into subgroups. And then questions are given to each subgroup, right? And then the subgroup discusses each question or topic for 10 minutes or something like that. And the subgroups answer the questions as a team, right? They formulate an answer, a group answer that they all agree on, and then they write it down, right? So there's a structure, right? The facilitator will say we have 10 questions to get through, and we have exactly 90 minutes. So therefore, we have exactly 9 minutes per question or something like that. Usually a large group is broken down into smaller groups, and you usually have a special schedule right? What is the schedule of this session, right? A lot of focus groups are not very well managed, and the schedule is not very well managed, right? Everything takes too long and needs more time than anticipated. And so during that time that the group is discussing their answers to the questions, somebody takes notes, right? Maybe everybody takes notes, but usually each subgroup has somebody that's taking notes, right? And every participant might have a Post-it note or a Post-it notepad that they're writing their thoughts on, right? So each participant writes their ideas or thoughts on notepads or Post-it notes, real or virtual. Right, in this class we're using Google Docs on the Friday workshops. Participants can move and manipulate Post-it notes to cluster their ideas into common themes. That's why Post-it notes are used so often. So you can imagine a question, everybody writes their answer down on a Post-it note, and then everybody shows their answer, and the ones that are related or are in agreement with each other form a group, right? They might form two groups, for example. And there are different tools to facilitate this process, like Miro, Google Jamboard, Teams whiteboards, or just sheets of paper, right? Or boards like this. Has anybody here seen Miro, or Miro, however you pronounce that? Has anybody seen that before? Yeah, a few people. Does anybody like it? I don't like it. I hate it, actually. So that's something in Teams that supposedly helps with this process, like the whiteboard, for example. That's what a Miro board looks like, a virtual Post-it note. So you can imagine anybody can add a Post-it note or a drawing, and then you can imagine clustering those, right, into different groups or different sets, right? I mean, the problem with Miro boards is, like, they just disappear, generally speaking. Like, I don't know if anybody has what experiences you have, but every time I've been involved in something like a Miro board, there's a creation process, and then the session ends, and the whole thing is just forgotten and deleted forever. Has anybody else experienced that? Like, I've never seen any follow-up or any, like, use of the Miro board after the session is finished. It's usually just deleted and forgotten forever. So, at the end of each discussion session, there's a process to regather the information from each subgroup, right? If you've divided a focus group into subgroups, and they are given a question to answer, they discuss it for 10 minutes, then you solicit the answer from a representative of the group at the end of the 10 minutes, or to get the answers, right? If you have split the group into subgroups, gather them together and ask one person per group to summarize whatever it is they were discussing. And then you thank the participants for attending, and so on. You can create an archive or a photograph of the Post-it notes or whatever notes, and this is a so-called primary record. If the focus group is really good, and the facilitator is really good, then what happens after is the facilitator will write a report of their findings. Like, here are the questions we asked, and here's a summary of the answers that we got from each subgroup. and here's a summary of the answers we got as a focus group. That's really what's supposed to happen at the end of a focus group, is the facilitator writes a report about their findings for that day. And this could be what happens in your dissertations, for example. Your supervisor might ask you to conduct a focus group session. Then you conduct you write out your questions, and then you have to write a report as part of your dissertation, right, on your findings. You can also have open discussions and evaluation, right? You can just have topics, a set of topics that the participants think about, and ask for reflections on those topics. It doesn't have to be very specific questions. You can even ask participants to suggest ideas, right? You can say, I could open up a Google Doc right now, right? And I could just say, hey, I want ideas about how to improve this research methods module. And then I invite the entire class to start editing that Google Doc. Like, what topics do you want to talk about? We can talk about the lectures. We can talk about my makeup. We can talk about the workshops. We can talk about Moodle. Like, what are the topics? And you can just start adding topics that you want to discuss. Right, and generally you turn negatively phrased statements into positive statements, right, to prevent it from turning into something really destructive and rather than constructive. And then you can also ask the audience members of the participants to vote, right? They can vote on what they think is the most important topic, or what are the most important things to change. Okay, so focus groups are basically picking out a very special set of people and trying to get their opinions and their information and their answers on specific questions, as opposed to a general interview, which could be with anybody, right, in a one-on-one setting. Are there any questions about focus groups or interviews?
Question?
Yep.
Only for research can use focus group this word. For example, I seen a kind of form of recruitment. They will ask the different candidates to have a group.
Focus group?
Yes, focus group to choose the proper candidates. Is that account to focus group?
Yes, if I understand what you're saying, yes, that's very true and very correct. So these interviews apply to jobs and the recruitment process. Yes, that's true. So everything I said today applies to job interviews. And employers often, like you just said, they often form focus groups. They often do this. So they'll bring in a group, and that's a focus group, right? Everybody that applied to that job, that's a focus group. That's a very special group of people.
Assessment center.
What's that?
Assessment center.
It could be an assessment center, it could be, yep. But an employer will very often bring all of the people who applied to a specific job together at the same time to form a focus group. They will do this. It happens very often. Especially, I think now it's even more trendy. And then they'll give those people groups sets of questions to answer. And what they do is they'll observe how you conduct yourself in a team setting. They're going to observe you. How do you conduct yourself in a team setting? Do you talk to the people around you? What kind of a participant are you? They're looking for different kinds of participants. They're looking for the quiet ones, but they're really looking for the leaders. Like, who volunteers to lead the discussion? That's a very special person, right? And so they're looking to see how these people interact with each other and what kinds of people emerge out of this process. Who emerges as a leader? Who emerges as a good communicator? Who emerges as a good facilitator? Who emerges as a good communicator? So that happens definitely in the recruitment process. Yeah. Yeah.
So we are talking today is for research. So the question is, the process is important, but in crucial circumstance, it's more important to observe the people's role.
Well, what we talked about today applies. What we talked about today applies to your dissertation, because for some projects you're going to be asked to conduct interviews or surveys or focus groups. For some projects, it's something that you have to discuss with your supervisor. But this happens to be something that also happens in the real world. In the real world, you have interviews, focus groups, and these kinds of methods for research. So it happens, it happens to be a very valuable set of skills that are applicable in both contexts, if that makes sense. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, if you're happy, we're free to end the session. Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day.